Hi, I'm Ed Marison and welcome to the Vininspo podcast. This is where wine is a travel experience, and this week we're embarking on a bittersweet voyage with Yarra Valley winemaker David Bicknell. Dave is best known for his multi-award-winning quarter-century stint with the Coldstream producer Oakridge, from which he was made, as he puts it, forcibly redundant by its corporate owners in July 2026. I feel like the spectre of Dave looms large over the Aussie wine scene, belying the fact that he is a rather private man who's undoubtedly become more public since the Oakridge bombshell fell. This interview was my idea, not his, because I hadn't actually met this bloke, apparently described by one podcast as, and excuse my French, an arrogant, mouthy motherfucker. Now don't worry, you won't get that kind of language here on the Vininspo podcast, of course, but I certainly felt that a lot of people feel like they know Dave Bicknell. Some people really do, some really don't. Whichever category you fall into, I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation. I started by asking where young Dave could be found kicking around.
Well, young Dave was moved around a lot. We seemed to move house every couple of years because of where Dad worked. My father was in the Merchant Navy, was a ship's captain and a master mariner, and got torpedoed twice during the Second World War. When he took land-based jobs, we moved around a lot. So he was from Leith in Edinburgh, which is the port town. Mum from a village outside of Edinburgh. In that typical Scots fashion, they went where the work was, and we lived in various places across the UK. And one day Dad came home and said, we're moving to Australia. I've taken a job in Australia. It was exciting. Difficult for my older brother, who was 13, I was about 8, and we moved to Australia, and that was just such an eye-opener coming to this country. Everything was different. The light was different, the feeling, just the whole vibe of the place. We lived in the travel lodge in Melbourne for a couple of weeks when we first moved out, and I know my older brother hated it, my sister hated it, my younger brother probably too young to really absorb what was going on, and I just used to go out and wander the streets, and that was interesting because really coming to this country changed the direction of all of our lives in a way that we still don't recognise. I was supposed to go to sea or be an engineer or follow in the family footsteps. My father, his twin brother, uncles, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-great-grandfather. None of that happened. The thing that I loved and wanted to do was be a professional sports person. So I was athletic, which some people find hard to believe these days, but that's what age does to you. And that's really all I wanted to do, whether it was swimming or running or football. I even got quite good at playing cricket and never touched a cricket bat until I came to this country. And that's all I wanted to do. And of course it didn't happen because, sort of fast forward to when I was 16, I badly broke one of my legs. And I never got back that sort of native athletic talent again. I was never quite as fast, could never kick quite as straight or as far. And, for a teenager, well, that was pretty hard to take.
Assume the age that you came over around 8 and having moved around a bit before that probably the Australian experience for you at your age compared to your siblings was really where your identity began to be kind of concreted, and sport must have been so wrapped up with that. So as well as the outlet that would have had for you, it must have really affected kind of how you saw yourself a little bit.
Yeah, totally. And I remember when I was at primary school, and there was some foot race that I was in, and I basically let someone else win because he was in the year above me. I remember afterwards thinking, why did I do that? I could have smoked this guy. And that competitive nature that I have, I reckon back to that moment, that really kind of kicked it off. And after that, it was just like, I'm going to beat everyone at everything when I play sport. That was it. And that kind of happened when I went to high school. I would enter into everything and really try and win everything, even at a sort of higher level, against other schools. And I made it at school in backstroke to the all-high swimming finals. Came second in Victoria in backstroke because I was lousy at turning but very fast in the water. And it was just that sheer determination to win, be the best, to finish on the podium. That's never left me.
Yeah, were you competitive in the classroom as well?
Early on I was, yes. Again, pre-leg breaking, yes, and and I'd always try and be in front of people in the class as well, to be ahead of everyone in, what we were learning and so forth. But, again, when I broke my leg, then I just became a morose, sulky shit of a teenager and was a bit lost for a number of years, I think. And I think a lot of kids go through that as well. You just, what is it I'm supposed to be doing? And you kind of rebel against everything, rebel without a cause. There's absolutely no cause, but that's where you end up. And I think, in hindsight now, it's kind of helped me in terms of how I deal with my own kids and friends' kids and people I work with who are younger, trying to give them some guidance as well. You don't have to worry about some of these things. Sometimes, things in your life will change and you'll find a pathway where you find your own people. And in the end, that's what you need to do to survive in this world, isn't it? You find your tribe and you hang out with them.
You do indeed. And I'm guessing that you, like me, were very much into your morose, sulky, but awesome music when you were younger, which I guess was part of the scene. But in terms of other things that you were into, where did you go in terms of studies, or what was on the radar for you next?
I like the idea of getting into medicine, but I never tried hard enough at school to go down that route. And the music thing was big. My older brother in particular was, well into music and was close friends with a whole bunch of guys who, sort of really, or some of them are still in the industry in music. So that was a big thing. And we used to go out and see bands a lot, and with my brother and with other friends. And the music thing was a really big thing. And it was always on the alternative side. So, when things like, the birthday party were getting started, I saw The Cure play at the Corner Hotel in 1980 when they first came to Australia, that sort of stuff. And so we sometimes we'd go out 5 or 6 times a week, and Dad was always working, he was always away, and so we were kind of uncontrollable to a degree. But there was no clear direction of what I was going to do. And by the time I was 16, 17, I basically had fallen foul at school, a number of schools. Spent a period there where I was on unemployment benefits trying to find work. And when you're 16 and there's no real public transport and you've got no transport to get anywhere and you're looking at jobs like, I worked out at the docks for a while, worked for an engineering firm down there doing ship repairs and, night shift in a 7-Eleven, this sort of stuff. And it was hopeless. And I knew that there was something else out there for me. So after a, really sort of unhappy, really morose kind of 6 or 7 months of, doing nothing and just this static life, sucked it all up, apologised to my parents and went back home and went back to school. And did really well in the first year back and really terrible in my last year at school because girls and drinking and and it was like every night of the week, there were nights where we'd play cards until we'd go to school the next morning. A bunch of mates who were all pretty loose, and that's what we did. I was clueless as to what I was going to do. Didn't do very well at the end of school, and I guess was, again, wise enough to realise that I actually needed to go back to night school. And I was working as a security guard in North Melbourne and was doing night school with some science subjects to finish off HSC. And I saw this ad to go and do nursing. And I thought, well, I think I can do that. And one of the guys I'd gone to school with, his mother was quite high up in the ANF. Spoke to her, and she said, well, this is what I think you should do, and go here. So I went to Prince Henry's Hospital in St Kilda Road and applied to do nursing and got in. And my whole sort of world pivoted around that. Ended up being a registered nurse and working in all sorts of critical areas, and that was a really important part of me learning about people. When you're at the coalface of public health and people are dying, they're unwell, you learn a lot about people, and that's always stayed with me all the way through. This is a good thing, this is a bad thing. I've had to resuscitate people both in hospital and in the real world. And those skills that I learnt have, always stayed with me. Many years later, I was on a long-haul flight coming back to Australia, and there was this old French couple I was sitting next to, and the old guy, old Maurice, or whatever his name was, stood up and had a heart attack on the plane. And I resuscitated him on the floor of the plane, and he survived. Those skills I've always treasured those, and I'm still friends with people that I nursed with as well. Most of them aren't in nursing now, and that was the thing, is that I realised that wasn't my thing, even though I had applied to do the market ambulance driving course, because, again, the adrenaline stuff, in the medical world I quite enjoyed, but that didn't happen because I went travelling.
Right. How did the travel come about, and where did you go?
I was at a juncture in life where I've been going out with a girl for a number of years, and it was pretty serious. It looked like, we might end up together for the rest of our lives. And another friend of mine who I'd been at school with said, I'm heading over to Europe, at the start of the year. And I went, oh, I think I need to come with you. And, there's one of those sliding door moments. So we, basically walked around Europe for the best part of a year. And that relationship all fell over. And it was at that point that I decided I was not going to pursue the public health route. And that's where, another, what had been a minor sort of stream in my life came forward. And, I grew up in a house where we also had wine. So even though Dad was most sailors drink beer, but, Dad was an officer. And through his travels, he really loved wine. We also had wine on the table when we were growing up. And, I thought I knew a little bit about wine. I knew what I liked, and there's a good starting point. And travelling around Europe and trying wines in all these different countries, and I just thought, oh, well, maybe I should do this. And it was one of the nursemates was the one that had said to me a few years earlier, there's a course in South Australia, you can actually study winemaking, get a degree in winemaking. And I thought, wow, that's just fucking outrageous. And, there's a degree in drinking you can get. And, once that idea was lodged in my brain, that's all I ever wanted to do. So, and I remember I met up with Dad in London right towards the end of the year. And he said, oh, so when are you coming back? When are you doing the ambulance thing? And I said, I'm not. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, oh, when I get back, I'm going to move to South Australia and go to this college there, this ag college, and study winemaking. And he just said, what the fuck are you talking about? Why would you give away all those years of study and work and the seniority that you have, even where you are with nursing, and you're earning good money? Why would you do that? And I just said, I feel I need to make something, and I think this might be the thing. It was just an idea. When I came back home, I had a backpack and nothing else. And I got on a train and didn't even have a car, a train to Gawler and a bus out to Roseworthy College, and never looked back.
Yeah, right. So you kind of arrived in that idea and that justification as well that had come out of your mouth talking to your father in London. Did that feel at any point like it was like, what am I doing here? Or did you just get there and feel, actually, this is my place?
Yeah, it was like that. It was exciting. It was an experience. It was just like getting on a ride at a theme park. Everything was foreign, and I knew nothing of how you did any of the stuff. And, I'd never been a particularly good student, and I'm, studying for a science degree. But it was really so cool. It was so interesting. And I was really lucky because it had, mentors like Pat Ireland, who, I think most people of my generation and preceding that over, a number of decades would all reference having a big impact on their lives, studying viticulture and understanding, the chemistry behind wine. So it was so much fun at Roseworthy. And the group that I studied with were a bit sort of unusual in that there were a lot more older people that had done other things. And that's where, sort of day one, I met Nikki, and she'd come from hospitality and she had a degree in arts and politics or sociology or whatever, and had done a lot of hospo work and had come over to Roseworthy, and Steve Flamsteed, and, who, was a chef. And we just, day one, just kind of hit it off. And Nick and I have got 3 kids, and we've been together ever since. And Steve is my brother from another mother, and all of our kids kind of have all grown up together, and our careers have, intertwined and crossed over at various points, and we still see each other pretty much every week, do a lot of stuff together. And it was just a really good group of people.
It sounds very good. And you mentioned, your, I suppose, musical tastes come from that alternative side, and it sounds like when you got to college, you were kind of the alternative kids, as you say, a bit older. presumably some people who had gone in there with a bit more sense that from a younger age that there was continuity in them going there to study, and presumably some kind of dynastic family people who were Roseworthy. So how did that fare with your peer group and the way that you thought and the way you performed, but also your competitive nature? Because presumably that came out as well.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And so, why was I there? Why were people like us there? Because we didn't know shit. And, we'd never pruned vineyards or worked in wineries and done vintages and all sorts of things like that. And it did, because we strove really hard to be good at doing those other things. And I was, I guess, a good enough student that I got work for the faculty as well, part-time work, helping with some of the research projects that we're on, and worked really hard at on the sensory evaluation side. While I would say I'm not the greatest native taster, I became very good at developing a tasting memory, which still sort of shocks a few people, when I can say, oh yes, I remember we had that 82 Yarra Yearing in the house in Gawler in 1992, and it tasted like this. And I wrote detailed notes on everything I tasted and topped sensory evaluation at Roseworthy. Got invited to start judging in wine shows and became good at that. And of course, then that led on to things like the Evans tutorial, and duxed that in the third year, and have had a fantastic time being a wine show judge right across the country. But that was that competitive thing to a degree where, trying to remember everything, trying to, make sure that I could place it in my memory somewhere like a filing cabinet, and being able to recall aspects of wine. And that's really helped me in the winemaking sense. Maybe not so much earlier, not really realising this, but later being able to piece things together and go, okay, I think there's an improvement here. If we could get it to taste a bit more like this, and if we do that, then it'll make something better.
Yeah, cool. And was this a time where, when you were at university, you could be very confident of finding work afterwards? How did that come about?
No, and to get through university, I washed dishes. I didn't go to the hospital and pull nursing shifts, which would have given me a lot more money. Decided to go the hard way and, scratch around for money and work in hospitality mostly, and for the faculty. When we came out the other side of Roseworthy, there weren't really many jobs around at all. And I think in the end, though, there was only about 3 of us that actually went into full-time work, other than the kids that had come through that had families to go back and hide with. And I had done a vintage at De Bortley in 92, I think it was. Steve Webber said, come back here when you're done. There's a job for you. And so Steve Webber has been really early on, has been one of the most important mentors that I had, particularly for trying to think outside of the square and to try and understand that there's always some other possibility. You don't have to conform with everything. That was a great period. So I ended up with, working for De Bortley for 10 years. It really sort of set me down a pathway of thinking about the whole thing in life is you're either a conformity enforcer or a diversity generator. They're the only 2 machines that really are real. So you're one or the other. And I think that's been good and bad, because it kept me out of the corporate world, because I didn't want to be a reinforcer. I wanted to, do stuff, make stuff, and make stuff that people went, wow, that's different, and I really like it. So, yeah, the diversity generator. Thanks to the Ghost for that. That's one of his great lines. Stephen Walker, who was, on Triple R, he was always talking about it, the conformity enforcer versus the diversity generator. I love that.
That's right. Skull Cave RIP. But the chance as well, I'm assuming there, you've talked about the diversity of what I suppose the Yarra under De Bortley was doing, huge range, but also the ability, or not just the ability actually, the imperative to push further, to go beyond there. And I suppose that kind of ambition fed right into your path as someone who was competitive and wanted to go further. So how did that role at De Bortley for you kind of progress?
Well, they opened my eyes to possibility. And one of the first things they did, there was a winemaker who had left up in Griffith, and they said, can you go up and make the whites? This is, we're only in 1994. I remember going up there and getting this 30-page kind of handout, and there's, hundreds of thousands, millions of litres of all sorts of varieties and whatever. It's like thrown at me, and, kind of look after that. And that was really good because on the logistic side and the understanding of how you piece things together, it totally helped me form a basis for everything that you do down the track. I mean, people who do winemaking who have experience in big wineries dealing with lots of logistics and volumes and making pieces fit always have an ability to move into smaller places, and it all makes sense. But I'm not certain that if you've only ever worked in small places that you can ever cope if you go to a bigger place or understand how it actually has to work. So I was really fortunate with that. And 94, the Griffith vintage. Then I did the Yarra vintage, and I'd already said to Steve, look, I want to go over to France and do a vintage over there, and he was 100% behind it. So I did a vintage in Burgundy, and again, because of Pat Ireland, he sort of helped where I went. I became part of a team that was doing some research in Burgundy as well with the company I was working for. So I got lots of work before vintage and an extra bit of work after vintage, like packing everything down, which was great. And Steve rang me, Steve Flamsteed rang me. He was working in Alsace, and he said, come up here, we need more. And so I did a vintage up in Alsace as well, so I did 4 vintages for the year. And small traditional family company. And it brought a lot of things together that whole year, from the big machine and how that works to, a tiny little place in 14th century village in, sort of northern France. It's just like everything. There's this whole world of possibility, and everything was still, it was just like everything was glowing, everything was fun. It wasn't like work. It was just like going places and having fun.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I'm assuming as well that what was kind of a hunch a little bit when you started that you wanted to get into this area, that idea of going to Burgundy and Alsace and I suppose the coincidences that happen around that sort of stuff must cement, when it works out, that idea that actually it is somewhere that you belong.
Yeah, but I didn't have any confidence with the whole thing. That was the thing. I got offered a job in France, a winemaking job that year. Where I was working, they said, we've loved having you here, we really like you, and there's a job here if you want it. And I guess one of my traits is loyalty, and I said, I can't, I'm working for De Bortley, and I can't do that, and I actually don't think I know enough. I just don't feel I know enough to do that. And one of the sliding doors I never walked through, and that was just a total lack of confidence. And I mean, everyone thinks that, according to one podcast, that I'm a arrogant, mouthy motherfucker, but I certainly wasn't back then because I didn't feel I had the knowledge. In some regards, I wish I had stayed, but in the end, it's helped me develop a fierce loyalty to the winemaking of this country as well. And, and I'm incredibly proud of this industry that we work in and what this country's achieved in winemaking, and we don't celebrate it enough. Like, it's one of my real kind of hobby horses at the moment. We don't treasure our wines like other countries treasure their wines. I don't think we do. And we need to change that. If we're going to succeed in this country in fine wine, it's going to be when we start to reference our own history and the wines that we've made in the past, rather than what happens in another country. I think we're still kind of hung up about that. And sure, I get the context of reference points and, where we sit, but you'd see posts of wine shows everywhere, and inevitably all the wines that they're drinking are from another country. And we still see other countries as being the best. And why isn't it us? This competitive thing. It's like, fuck the French, we can beat them. And there are so many things, I think, in winemaking that we're ahead of them as well. And all you've got to do is look at the rise of Australian Chardonnay, Pinot Noir and Grenache in particular. Look where those wines are. And if you go back 30 years ago, no one really sort of, it was all reference to another country. But we've been doing these things for decades and we're good at it. We collectively have that competitive streak in us where we're not going to sit around and wait 2,000 years to sort this shit out. We try and get this piece together within a generation or two. And I think that we've been able to do that. There's been, the last, sort of 40 years or so, Australian wine has just gone off the charts. We're clever at this.
Yeah, I think maybe we're getting a bit better at it, but I think a lot of the problem actually doesn't necessarily lie with Australia. It relies with the way that the reference points of fine wines are set up in a global sense, that you're kind of pegged back on the criteria that there are. And I think probably that some of the modern reference points are helping us get there a bit more, i.e., well, we'll get onto it in a sec, what you've done with Oakridge and the single vineyard idea, or the specificity of a place that can be recognised a bit more over time to cement that idea. As I say, because the rules of how we're judged kind of belong to the French, whether we like it or not. I think there's a little bit of that happening. But that probably is quite a good segue to get us to Oakridge, because speaking of loyalty, speaking of the fantastic time that you had at De Bortley, it must have been quite hard to leave there, but obviously something else came up.
Yeah. No, it was awful, and I remember going to the interview and who that was with, and it was a big step. But I felt that need to kind of break out of a few things. And Steve Webber and I, we fell out over that and we didn't talk for years, which, was a real shame. But it allowed me to go on and do something else. And that other thing, the Oakridge thing, also determinedly kept away from anything that De Bortley had or were doing as well. There's a different pathway here, and this is what I think the valley should be doing as well, and where I think the best fruit is coming from, in my mind. And, De Borts were north of the river, and Oakridge was on the south of the river, and I really focused on that part of the valley. And I guess, 25 years later, everyone wants to be in that part of the valley because of, climate change has kind of pushed us that way. So, I kind of lucked in to a degree. My competitive bloody-mindedness took me there, but it turned out to be the right place.
Yeah, could you just give us a little potted history of Oakridge from its origins to where it was where you joined the company?
Yeah. Well, it was a family business, and it was in, I guess, what we would now see as the second wave of kind of pioneers, planting back in the valley, so in the 70s, late 70s. And a family of German origin, originally, Sitzlafs. Old Jimmy was a commercial builder and loved wine, loved Riesling in particular. And they planted a vineyard up in Wandon Seville area in what used to be a cherry orchard, and had some fantastic results in the early 90s with the quality of some of the wines. And their ambition kind of took hold of it and pushed it to the point that it broke. And Evans and Tate, Frank Tate came riding in on his winged horse when he was on a spending spree in the early noughties and, in his words, rescued Oakridge. And that's where I came in 2002 when the Sitzlafs departed. In the original family era, they had moved by the mid-90s from the Wandon Seville to Coldstream. So they sold the original vineyard, now known as Five Oaks, and moved to Coldstream. That's when they got into financial difficulty. They just pushed it too fast, too hard, and lost control. And that's, Evans and Tate came in, and then, of course, 4 or 5 years later, had the same fate. Just everything got pushed too far, wine gluts. Evans and Tate fell over. The company got white-anted from almost internally. And like all good cockroaches, I survived. Survived the first era of Evans and Tate, where some things got done, because the winery was totally broken when I went to Oakridge. And I remember, the first day I was there for 14, 15 hours, and I came home and said to Nick, I think I've made a terrible mistake here. The place is completely fucked. Everything. The wine's terrible. It's, there'd been a period of neglect when the business was being sold, and all sorts of things had fallen apart. However, I also inherited a couple of people, and when I went to Oakridge, there was a young student winemaker who'd been working in cellar door, just stepped into the winery, a boy called Adrian Rodder, and another guy, Martin Singh, who was been taken on for vintage in 2002, and he'd come from a sort of retail background and was a mate of Adrian's. I had the pleasure of, working with Adrian for 7 years before he moved up to Beechworth and pushed his career on. And Martin is still at Oakridge. And we were a bit of a gang, and we started getting results early as well. 2004, we had, at the Adelaide Wine Show, Best Chardonnay White Wine of Show. So we turned the corner on the winemaking quite quickly. And the reason we were able to do that is I'd been so well trained really in those De Bortoli years as well. And I had a really good understanding of how to put things together. And yeah, everything just from then, everything just got better. It was always hard, and the winery was crap. Nothing worked, but we made everything work. Just sheer bloody-minded determination to not be shit at everything that we did, and that's still very much the focus of at Oakridge. Is like we want to make the best wine that we possibly can, and it to be the best wine in the Yarra Valley, and the best wine in the country. We've got to do everything we can to make the best wine we possibly can, and to always reason there's an opportunity to make better, like to never relax about what we're doing. And again, that competitive thing. Years earlier, I remember at some awards dinner, there was a winemaker, I won't say who it was, who got up and it was wine of the year or whatever, and he said, I can't imagine making a better wine. And I thought, I'm fucking having you. I'm having you. Your history.
I'd love to know who that was.
Your history. They're not. But what I was able to do was take Oakridge from being, the worst producer in the valley to being, by third-party endorsement, the best a couple of years ago.
And you said you turned the corner on winemaking quickly, and that was largely thanks to your training at De Bortoli. But obviously, going into a job like this, I'm assuming there's a lot of stuff that you don't know how you're going to handle from a management, leadership, team building point of view. Did you surprise yourself with how that came about? Were there things that in the leadership sphere you discovered that you could do that you didn't know you could do? But also, you've already acknowledged the teamwork is really, really important, but I feel like it's not always acknowledged how much of a leadership quality it is to handle the teamwork side of things in winemaking. So how did that sort of pan out in terms of shaping the business, which has obviously continued, as you said, until very recently, under your stewardship to be successful?
What I learnt about dealing with people and the nursing period and being respectful of everyone. Because the wine industry, it can be pretty brutal and pretty hard on people. It kind of can step all over people's feelings sometimes. And I've been able to, bring that respect for individuals in, even though they're different, and give them the opportunity. And that's one of the things that, De Bortoli is famous for, is the number of people who work there and who are well trained and have gone on and had great careers in winemaking. I love that part, and that's something I've really tried to bring into Oakridge as well. And I think we've done a really good job of training people and helping other people move forward in their careers. That nothing's forever, and that's okay. And when people express that desire to go on and take the next step, we're 100% behind it. So I think there's a style of leadership that I've been able to bring into Oakridge that we've really helped and furthered people's careers despite how different their personalities are, and some of them likeable, some of them not so likeable. But that doesn't matter. It's the discipline and the talent, and to be able to push that up. The great difference between, I think, being a leader and a manager. And I really subscribe to that idea of, there's a bunch of people who are really good at managing stuff, but they can't lead. They can't get a following behind them. Again, in football teams, they're often, ordinary footballers who are great leaders. They become the stars of their team, not because they've got any unique, real kind of talent for it, but they're able to mentally get everyone else into a position where they're motoring, they're doing everything they can. They often have more talent. That's how I feel about Oakridge, that I've been able to help, more talented people, get them the right guidance and get them on the right pathway where they naturally go, well, I don't think I need you any longer. There's this other job. And I'm just like, that's great. I've loved seeing that. I've loved how Adrian's career's developed, and Tim Perrin had his career develop it, in particular, they're two, kind of standouts. And the team recently left from Oakridge, Tim Dexter and Victoria Schwartz. They're on that pathway. And that's one of the bits that really hurts, is that I won't be there for when they take those next steps. It's like they're my team, they're my kids, and I want them to do really well. But you've got to have strong leadership to make that happen, so that they can conceive all the ideas. They understand all the science, but it's possibility. What's possible?
Yeah, we're going to get to the present day in a sec, but I think it would be remiss of me not to talk a little bit about the Yarra Valley and the most obvious wine styles that you've become known for with you here. So, first of all, just the Yarra Valley itself, for those who might be listening to this from afar or even closer but want your perspective on it, how do you see the sort of lie of the land in the Yarra? What really matters in terms of positioning, site selection, and how to handle the grape varieties that are being grown there to really make those world-class wines?
It's bigger than everyone thinks and smaller at the same time. It's quite a big area. It's not homogenous in any way. And that's what's given us the ability to work with site and really promote site. I guess the old firms that are most well known, the Mount Marys and Yarra Earrings of the world, were already doing it anyway. And with the influx, particularly, in the mid to late 80s, early 90s, and, lots and lots of businesses flourishing, it sort of became a bit more of a commodity, because that's where wine was going at the time. The Oakridge thing is we sort of went the other way, and we were small, and the whole thing was just like a big science experiment. If we apply a set of rules and values to what we do, and we keep that consistent across different sites, then if we're right about the site being the driver, the wines will taste differently. And I guess it was, there were two hypotheses that we were testing in the whole thing. One is that if we use the same technique with two different varieties, will they taste the same? And of course they don't. Just Sauvignon Blanc doesn't taste like Chardonnay. So pretty easy to tick that one off. And hypothesis number two is, if we applied the same winemaking with the same variety from different sites, the wines will taste different. And of course they are. It took them 2,000 years to work this out in Burgundy, but again, we're not going to wait 2,000 years. We want to sort this out in 20. And that's what really guided us with the whole Oakridge experiment, if you like. And again, that just opened up possibility. The deeper we got into it, the more we found sites that we liked and made more expressive wines. Where did it put us into the whole scheme of the Yarra Valley? Well, I've used the analogy before that it's like the Tour de France. You've got the peloton, and the Yarra Earrings and the Mount Marys of the world, they're in the breakaway group. They're down the road, and we're at the front of the peloton, with giant steps, pedaling along, looking at each other, going, "Oh, who's going to go next?" Because that's where we want to be. We want to be spoken about in the same breath as those old firms, that we're seen as being that good and we're recognised for it. So again, there's no escaping the competitive nature of it. And I think collectively we've been very open about it as well, and we've really pushed each other as a group of businesses as well. That we're collectively in the Yarra Valley, we're only as good as the worst winemaker, and none of us want to be that. So, none of us want to be the lanterne rouge at the back of the bus, and so it is competitive, but we tell each other what we're doing. Because again, if we apply that logic that if your vineyard is, a different part of the valley, then you will make wine differently anyway. And, vive la différence, that's part of it. And it's allowed us to make a group of wines that are from different sites where we feel the quality is the same. Quality comes in horizontal bands, and style comes in vertical stripes. So everything has its place in there somewhere if you're applying the same rigour to everything you do. Again, it's there's a lot of sort of philosophical mumbo jumbo with this, but if you can break it down into really logical pieces like that, then sometimes it actually makes more sense.
Yeah. With Chardonnay, we'll start with that. Could you just go through some of the sites that you've worked with over the years at Oakridge and kind of where they are, but also what you see as being their talent for growing Chardonnay that really stands out as a Chardonnay of place?
It's a long list. In fact, just on the tangent here, we were about to go through, and every single vineyard wine that we have made over the journey, we were about to go through and taste all of those wines. And there's nearly 90 individual Chardonnays from multiple sites. So, probably the most well-known from a grower perspective, Willow Lake, Applejack, Stroke, Guerin Vineyard, Lusatia Park, Bastard Hill, Val Stewart's, Thunder and Diamond, Stroke Bacala Ridge, Hank, Stroke Teasers Road, all of these vineyards. And in the contemporary Oakridge sphere, there are three kind of important ones, Willow Lake and Hank and Hazeldean, which is another owned Oakridge vineyard. And they all bring different things. Hank is, the kind of the modern athletic beauty. Willow Lake is the kind of the graceful grande dame type wine. And Hazeldean is the kind of the more skittish outlier with a lot of contemporary personality, but without the grace of Willow Lake and without looking as stylized maybe as Hank is. These are the personality traits of those various farms, which is driven by there's clonal differences, sure, but the winemaking approach has always been consistent, and we haven't tried to vary that too much because, again, if you believe in the concept of terroir, which I know it's kind of a bullshit modern kind of thing that the French came up with in the probably the 50s, but if you believe in that virtue of certain sites can do it, you have to allow them to develop their own personality, a bit like people, as long as you can guide them in the right direction. And that's where Oakridge has landed. It wasn't consciously I started when I first went there, but when I sort of broke it down into the pieces, that's how it sort of played out. And like I said, it's allowed us to find the style and the quality bits everywhere and focus in on where are the absolute best bits. And that was the next bit that came, like the whole, not just the vineyard wine, but from a particular part of a block, because it gave us something, just that little bit more. And it wasn't, it was never about the obvious, things like size or volume. Again, it was more about a display of personality, of, je ne sais quoi, I don't know what. But it had enough, I don't know what, for us to go, that's the one we love. There's something that's really attractive about that.
Yeah. Speaking of wines, I suppose, coming in those, as you put it, vertical bands, Chardonnay is obviously the one that has really spanned a wide spectrum. Talk a lot about the way that pendulum has swung. When you started at Oakridge, that pendulum had gone and was, I suppose, garnering quite a lot of column inches in terms of what that Australian Chardonnay style had become. And I would also say that, I don't know if fairly or unfairly, but your name is often quoted in terms of dragging that pendulum back a long way, maybe too far. I was just wondering, from your perspective, where was it then, and how much credit, or whatever you might call it, do you take for it coming back a long way, or perhaps to where it is now? I mean, what do you feel that the sort of correct characterization of that pendulum swing is?
Again, sort of in a sporting analogy, I guess I was maybe, I was a leader on the field, but it couldn't happen without a team around you. And there was a whole bunch of us who were doing the same thing at the same time. Tom at Yaddy Lake and Steve at Jard Steps and us at Oakridge, etc., etc. And we were all sort of part of the same movement. We just had a bit more success, which I think has pushed us to be at the forefront of that, rightly or wrongly, and it kind of doesn't matter. A lot of people try to do similar things, but of course, if you don't have the right vineyard, you can't do these things. If you're not in the right part of the country, you can't do these things. Not all regions are created equal, and not all vineyards are created equal. That's quite clear. And the reason that we went that way was because before that we were making what I describe now as Franken wines. They were just like, body parts stitched together, and so nothing kind of worked properly, like Frankenstein's monster. Because a lot of what was happening is we would go to Burgundy and we'd go and work there and taste there, and we would ask the questions, how did you do this, how did you do that? And we basically came back with a recipe. But, it's a different country, different soil, different clonal material, different cultural aspects in how they train the vines. The water's different, the light's different, everything's different. we tried to make de facto wines, and they were mostly pretty ghastly, and they never stood up. And so I think that rejection of trying to be de facto Burgundy and us not having, the codified laws that they're corralled to, where we could be freely expressive and do these things, just allowed us to evolve wine style. And I think a whole bunch of us got really good at it, and we spurred each other on and we talked about it, and it's just like Chardonnay has just become this monster in this country where there are so many good producers right across the country because they get it. And, they understand we want to make wine that tastes like it comes from somewhere. Yarra Valley, Victoria, Australia. We want to make Australian flavoured wine. And we're not so concerned about the other. It's become a philosophical project in many ways. And that continues, even my attitude towards aspects of how Chardonnay is made in this country now it's changed in the last 5 or 6 years as well. There's a lot of, really tricky wines out there now that are highly stylized. And I'm kind of leaning away from that sort of stuff. Again, into the conceptual side and ideas, the concept of purity. Purity is not measurable, and it's a totally subjective value. It doesn't exist. It's an idea in your mind. But how do you translate that into a glass of wine? I love that idea about chasing something that you can never catch. I'm a car chasing dog, all right? I admit it. But how do we do that? Because that's the next step for fine wine in this country. It's being seen as making these wines that have this inherent beauty and quality that you can't really put your finger on, but you just know that they're better than the others.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I guess to sort of paraphrase, and you might disagree with this anyway, but essentially that pendulum swing in a way, I suppose, is from a wine of style that was a very big and everything in the kitchen sink thrown at its style to, in a sense, wines of style at the other end of the spectrum, which were the opposite way, the leaner style where perhaps, again, chasing technique that may not have been applicable to place or to the fruit that they were working with may have gone too far that way. But where it sits in the middle are those wines of not so much style, but wines of place and wines of ease. And when the ease is there, the place seems to loom a bit larger, which is probably where Chardonnay sits at the moment, where it's really successful, which is happening in quite a lot of different places.
Yeah. I love the idea of translucence with wine as well, that you can see every part of it. And you can see all the detail. So a bit like, I love a good analogy, a bit like a human model where you can see all of the organs inside, and you can see every piece and see how it's all connected. And I think those wines that have got that incredible kind of detail are those wines, and they're easy. They're not complicated to understand, but they deliver so much pleasure when you taste them. That's the thing. And yeah, the pendulum does keep on swinging, and that's okay. But I think that, again, where the Yarra Valley is, there's a sweet spot, and lots of guys are in that sweet spot now. Lots. It's been great.
Yeah, and I think Chardonnay in general, and I think Pinot Noir as well, has, everyone acknowledges it's a really tricky grape to get right. Perhaps it's lagging Chardonnay in that regard because it's harder and maybe there are fewer places that can manage it. But you've obviously had a lot to do with experimenting in that regard. And I know Pinot Massif for you and your friends has been a hugely proud kind of history because of the chance that you're throwing in the mix and the vulnerability a little bit in there too, but the collaboration and the sense that you're all in it together and it's really worth the ride. So tell me a little bit about Pinot Noir and the Pinot Massif experience.
In the early noughties, a few of us were pretty pissed off that all anyone could talk about with Pinot Noir was either Burgundy or New Zealand. And for a lot of us, it was like, well, we've got to do something about this. So there was a gang of us that got together and started the workshop, Pinot Noir workshop, aka the Massive. And it was a gloves off approach. There was no media involved, and it was pretty hard for some people turning up their unfinished wines and basically being critiqued by 40 to 60 other Pinot producers. And of course, Pinot producers in this country, particularly back then, was, it's a pretty small band. I mean, in a numbers game, there's maybe, 200 Pinots in the country that are worth drinking. There's probably 10 or 12,000 Shirazes. So it's a real numbers game. But by taking the gloves off and us critiquing our neighbours and our competitive set as well, it's really pushed the boundaries, and we gave a lot of information, a lot of science through that as well about how to make improvements. And we always figured that if we could get one person every year who would come back the following year and had made better wine, then it was all worthwhile. And that really happened. And it happened with some hot shots in the industry as well, who already had big reputations. And we saw their wines, and a lot of us are going, what are people talking about? These wines are no better than ours. So again, the competitive kind of thing was in there, and the gloves were off. But everyone's wines just got better and better and better. And again, sure, part of it, vine age is a big part of Pinot Noir as well, and high quality Pinot Noir production. So that played into that. But there were occasions where you would see wines and just go, wow, that's so good. I wish I had made that. And the opportunity was always there to do that and take some of those lessons and come back, the next year. And we would often see that. It was so good. And it was a lot of fun. And we looked at everything across the planet as well. We'd focus every year on some different things as well. Wines from Chile, Germany, Canada, North America, etc., different regions. So there was a real perspective and context. We would invite people from other countries. We had guys from France come out as well. We had guys from New Zealand coming over. And the whole standard just lifted with everything. It was such a good thing. And in the end, it made me think that, maybe Pinot Noir is not that hard. You just got to have the right toolbox to get it all together. It made me actually think that Cabernet is even harder. Pinot Noir is an interesting one because you can make things that are a bit denser, blockier and darker, and you can make beautiful red fruited, fragrant things. And they're equal quality and everyone kind of gets that. Whereas Cabernet Sauvignon is so binary. It's either really good or it's terrible. That, I think, is a trickier variety, and we're in a position at the moment where, no one loves Cab in this country, it seems. And I don't get it because there's so many good producers. It's fallen out of fashion, favour. I'm not sure why, because it's such a good variety. But the interesting thing about the Yarra is, with apologies to Bortley and some others, including where I get Cabernet from at the moment, but there's a little strip on the Warramate Hills, where most of the good producers sit. Giant Steps, although they've pulled all their cab out now from the Sexton Vineyard, and Yarra Yering and Coldstream Hills and Dominic Porte and Oakridge, Medhurst, Hyde Park, Yeringberg, Punt Road, Mount Mary. And we're talking about 6 to 8 Ks by 2 Ks, and pretty much everyone's in that place. It's one of those really kind of unique little benches where that's where it comes from. There's a real hotspot there, and they are beautiful, fragrant, medium-bodied, savoury wines. They're so good at the table. Last night, I had some winemaking friends over for dinner, and we drank way, 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 way too much. But we had a beautiful bottle of 05 Cab last night from Oakridge, from the vineyard there, and it's just 21 years old, and it's got at least another 20 years in it. Just beautiful, fragrant, medium-bodied and supple. They're great drinks. We've got to get people back into the Cab thing.
They'll get there, I'm sure. Now, we'll move into the present day. Obviously, it goes against a little bit the grain of the Vininspo podcast in general to be remotely topical, but obviously things have changed in your life a great deal recently. A line that I'm sure will be quoted again that I have in front of me. They say you never know you're going to get boned until you do. And so it is. Is a post that you put up recently. You got an enormous amount of likes. I'm sure a lot of people have come out of the woodwork. I'm sure a lot of people close to you have come out to give you great support. But a bit of a bombshell for you at Oakridge recently. How are you feeling about that?
Oh, not good. It's hard to reconcile, because why would you remove where most of the IP has resided over the last 25 years when you're in the process of trying to sell that business? It feels very personal, and that's made me pretty angry They wanted me to say all sorts of things that were not true, and all I wanted them was to tell the truth about things. They made me forcibly redundant. And if you're selling the business, why would you do that? So, not in a good place with that. That was my reaction, is to put it out there. The response has been just overwhelming and upsetting as well. That's been pretty hard to take. And, to lose the body of work that I'd created, that's hard to take. The only kind of positive thing is that the team I'd put together, are really talented and dedicated and focused. They'll be okay. And they actually need more support from the public now than ever before, because while Endeavour might be public enemy number one, and in my opinion quite rightly so, it's still a business where it employs about 30 families, and these guys, they all care. The reason that they're there, they care about it, and they need that support, and Oakridge needs to do well now and not be dropped like a hotcake. I worry for them and how it will affect them, because none of this is their doing and nobody wanted this. We still don't understand why.
Yeah, and from a personal point of view, of course, it's not like even with all the success that came, you were ever really sitting pretty at Oakridge. I know that the puzzle was always being worked out, but also you had to navigate, 3 different ownership changes and, manage everything that goes around that as well. And when you say a life's work, I guess that team building, that identity of Oakridge is part of the life's work, not just the wines, but also we talked about identity and how it really does affect you when you put so much into something, when it's suddenly sort of taken away as well. Must leave you a little bit unmoored, I should think. But you do have obviously things going on for yourself, and as we know, a lot of support and a lot of recognition of the fact that it is largely down to your work. So Bicknell FC is obviously a huge focus now and has been making wines and garnering its own headlines for a while. So tell us a little bit about how that is shaping up now.
Well, I guess the only good thing off the back of this is there's been more of a focus on it, and that's good, because it was always a bit of a busman's holiday, and I never really put a lot of commitment into it other than it being, a hobby. A bit strange that your hobby is also the thing that you do in your day-to-day working life, but that's how I've always kind of felt about it. Like, until Endeavour took over Oakridge, it was just like going out and hanging out with your mates every day. It never sort of felt like work. They made it hard work. So it's allowed me to, to really put some effort into that now. And the other thing that's really changed is I've got a daughter who's sort of getting quite deep into the whole thing now as well. She's done 5 vintages and she's 22. And she actually has got a really good native palate. It's allowing me to now really sort of focus on a generational project, and that's the best thing that's happened in years, to actually, have one of my kids coming through who loves it the way I do. So it'll get a little bit bigger, but not much bigger, because, we want to keep all of those concepts, in place and keep it together and keep that focus. And so that has been a good thing. But it's not big enough to make a living out of. And when you're the wrong side of 60, unemployment is a little bit terrifying sometimes. It's not a good place to be a lot of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really quite aware. I mean, almost a little bit strange that you and I obviously hadn't even spoken before last week. And as I know, even though your reputation looms large, a very private person, it probably goes against your personality a little bit to have been in the news or be part of the news. I mean, that was never an intention. You wanted to just keep your head down and make wines at Oakridge. Do you think that with what's happened and with Bicknell FC, you might relax into being happier about not being more public, but you've probably spoken a little bit more recently, more openly than you've allowed yourself over time? Do you think that there might be a bit of a change there?
Yeah, I think so. And over the last couple of weeks, as I've, seen more and more people, and almost all of them have said, you look happy, you look relaxed. Have you lost weight? That sort of stuff. And that's been good. And maybe that is true. And I hope it's true. I mean, everyone thinks I'm, like Matt Harrop just calls me the grumpy Scot, and that I'm never happy. Well, I am. It's introspective and a bit more dour, and I've never really enjoyed being in the spotlight with things. Even things like the local wine show, I usually don't turn up. It's just stuff anyway. But for my team to get the recognition, I love that sort of thing. I love sort of being a step behind all of that and other people getting noticed for the work that they've done. I enjoy that. One of my kids gave me a book at Christmas time about how not to be a grumpy old man. And pleased to say I haven't opened it yet.
You might have time to read it now.
Well, I do. Yeah, I do have time to read it, but I'm working real hard. That's what I'm doing. I'm working real hard to be a bit more open and happier about stuff. A little less competitive in other areas as well. Enjoy some of the good things that are actually happening. Like, we've sold more wine under Bicknell FC in the last 3 weeks than we had done in 6 months beforehand. And that's been great. The response has been so overwhelming. It's been really fantastic. And thanks, Endeavour, for making my business actually start to work.
Well, that's good. I mean, we talked about it at the start of the conversation, though. I suppose before you were 8, you were moving around quite a lot. Then you really hit a groove in Australia when you started with the sport, but had a couple of things kind of break down and have to pick yourself up a couple of times. And wine, as I say, it sounds a little bit like a bit of a flight of fancy at the time, but a hunch that you had that's worked out well, certainly in something that you've managed to really excel at and also make a lot of friendships. And hopefully that is something to absolutely fall back on, the fact that you have over these years really found a place for yourself, but also those friendships, those relationships that really do matter when you reflect on them.
Yeah. Again, the responses of, I've had, family members burst into tears when I told them what happened. And I've had friends who've just gone, you fucking beauty. You're free. Now you can go and do all these other things. That's exactly how it's actually kind of felt. It's taken some skin off, that's for sure. But in that competitive way, I'm back. I'm so back.
And that's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and share it everywhere. Please don't underestimate the power of these endorsements in making it possible to produce original, thoughtful work. You can also subscribe to my Substack, that's edmerison.substack.com. For now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Patricio Garcia for the additional editing, and to my guest, David Bicknell of Bicknell FC. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers!